Hey guys, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to talk about observable and observer. In the previous part, we saw an example where observable was emitting the data one after another. If you look closely and try to find something similar to observable, you'll notice that it is quite similar to Iterator. Iterator pulls the data from the source, whereas observable source pushes the data towards the observers, which then operates on the data. Both are somewhat similar with opposite direction of the flow. And if you have worked with or know about Java 8 streams, which itself is a fancy iterator, recall how we use streams. We build a pipeline. First, we generate a stream from a source. Then we apply some intermediate operations. And finally, we apply the terminal operation, right? Here map operation transform each element received from the source, and for each method is the terminal operation which prints all the stream elements. Now think about observable. An RxJava observable is used in the same way. The last operation here is subscribe, which is the terminal operation here, and like Java 8 streams, observables are also lazy, meaning it does nothing until it is subscribed to. Once the observer gets subscribed, it starts executing the pipeline on the element emitted by the observable. So basically, it transforms and prints the strings just like the previous stream example, but unlike streams, we can get the data asynchronously here, which we'll talk about later. Now, let's see how the observable works. Have a look to the observable interface. So it's having method subscribe. Observer invokes the subscribe method to subscribe to an observable. And after subscribing to an observable, the observer basically passes three types of events to an observable. First is onNext. The source observable passes each item one at a time to the observer using the onNext method. Second is onComplete. This tells that no more onNext calls will occur. The emission of elements or the events is now complete. So this is invoked by observable to indicate that all the emissions are complete. Now comes the third and the last one, onError. In reactive programming, errors are just treated like data. As the data flows from observable to observer or through the complete pipeline, errors also gets propagated. They are also first-class citizens. So we have a third event onError. If we get any error or any event, that's get here in onError to be handled. So this basically communicates an error up the chain to the observer, where the observer typically defines how to handle it. The observable pipeline terminates here on onError, and no more emissions will occur, just like onComplete. But if we get encountered by an error, and onError method is invoked, onComplete will never execute. So you can think it as there are three different channels: data channel, onComplete channel, and error channel that can be treated and think upon separately. Now let's take an example to understand observable and observer and these events. Let's create the observable. Integer, call it source, and this time I'm going to go with anonymous inner class rather than writing lambda directly to bring the focus on how things are implemented. So we have a concrete class observable create, to create the observable. Here it needs the implementation of observable on subscribe, observable on subscribe. Observable on subscribe is an interface which defines the action to be taken when a subscriber or an observer subscribes to this observable. You don't need to go with the syntax or to memorize this. We have a very simple way, that is by writing a little lambda. So don't bother much about it. So this interface has method subscribe that takes observable emitter, and the subscribe method would only run when an observer is subscribed to the observable. So when observer subscribes to it or calls the subscribe of it, then what we're gonna do, or the subscribe method, what it will do, it will invoke the onNext on the past observer. Let's pass the data here. So first 10 and then emitter dot on next. Now let's say 11, and after completion of emission, invoke the on complete to signal that the emission is now complete. And in case of any error, we can wrap it in try catch, and here in catch, throwable, we will call the on error on this emitter. So basically the error will be handled by this on error. T, and here new, and let's replace T with integer, and here integer. So now observable, we have created the observable. Let's create an observer and subscribe to the observable from the observer. Let's see what we have to implement in order to create an observer. Look at this observer interface. We discussed all the methods except the onSubscribe method. OnSubscribe method is called once when an observer subscribes to an observable. So if we are going to create an observer, we have to implement these methods. Let's create the observer. So observer integer observer new observer. Let's add unimplemented methods and let's implement these methods. So first is onSubscribe. For now, let's just print here something. Let's print on subscribe, or let's just print subscribed. We will discuss this method later in this course. So for now, let's ignore this disposable and just go with this print statement. Next is on next. Here, let's print the element that we are getting from the observable on next, and let's print the element. Next is on error. If any error occurs, this will get called e dot, let's print the state trace. And the last one is on complete, that will be executed after completion of all the emissions. So here let's print completed. So we have created observable, we created observer. Next thing we have to do is to subscribe to the observable by this observer. So we will invoke the subscribe method on this source observable. Source dot subscribe and pass the observer here. So to the subscribe of observable, we pass the observer, which has all the implementation to all these four methods. And the rest we need is the data that is going to be passed to these methods. So when the subscribe method on this source observable is called, it invokes these methods or events by passing the data to these methods. So data part is handled by the observable or supplied by the observable, and the observer has the implementations for how it wants to handle the data or what it is going to do with the data. And that is how it works. So let's debug this code to see this flow. For that, we will be needing breakpoints. So I'm going to put breakpoints here in the subscribe method and in these four methods of observer, along with here where we are subscribing to the source observable. Now let's run this in debug mode. So first, the subscribe is invoked on the observable and the observer is passed to this. That is, the observer is subscribing to the observable. When it subscribes to the observable, the onSubscribe gets called and it prints subscribe, and then it invokes the onNext method by passing value 10. So this onNext of observer prints the value. Then again onNext with 11. So it emits the next element, which is 11, and again prints it. And then it invokes onComplete to signal the completion of emission of elements by the observable. And it prints completed. See the console? We get subscribed on next. So it emitted 10 and then it emitted 11 and then completed. So hope from this example it is clear that how observer and observable interact with each other. How the data part is handled by observable and the observer has the implementation part. And I know you might be thinking why we are doing all this and where we are getting the reactive and functional benefits here. Just wait a little, we will gradually discuss everything. So this was all about this lecture. See you in the next lecture.